Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Aubrey Jackson Solar, and I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Social Science Scholarship. I'm filling in tonight for Eric Stokin, who usually introduces these events. But in this capacity, I had the distinct pleasure of coordinating and helping coordinate, together with Eric and Amy Barnes, the Social Sciences Forum Lecture Series, which includes today's event, the Joan S. Korenman Lecture. I want to share that this lecture series has recently celebrated its 25th anniversary. It has featured world-renowned scholars, such as our guest, Dr. Banu Subramaniam, along with 2 Nobel Prize winners, a special assistant to the US President, a US Trade Ambassador, presidents of major think tanks, and countless public servants, and many more thought leaders. Our next SSF lecture is the W.E.B. Du Bois Lecture, which will be hosted on November 10th at 6 p.m. in the University Center Ballroom. We hope you can make it. You can learn more about the SSF series and its history, and even find recordings of past lectures by visiting our website at socialscience.umbc.edu. I also invite you to connect with the Center for Social Science Scholarship on social media, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Facebook, and Instagram with the handle at UMBC-SOC-SCI. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. I will now turn things over to the Department Chair of the Department of Gender, Women's plus Sexuality Studies, Vrishali Patel.
Adjust this a little bit for shorter people. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all today to the Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies Joan Korenman Lecture with our esteemed speaker, Dr. Banu Subramaniam. This year's lecture is the third and final lecture of a series funded by a $100,000 grant from the Mellon Foundation as part of its Affirming Multivocal Humanities initiative. Based on the important work happening in the department on challenging gender, sexuality, and race-based systems of oppression, the department was actually invited to apply for this grant. PI Dr. Carol McCann and co-PI Dr. Kate Drabinsky, sitting over there and over there, submitted a proposal titled Advancing Gender and Sexuality Studies in Community. And I just want to share with you a little bit from this proposal, which underscores the important work that's happening in the department. Quote, in the wake of increased attacks on the academic freedom of gender, sexuality, and LGBTQ+ studies, critical race theory, and the communities these fields represent, GWIST has rededicated itself to providing students with robust curricular and co-curricular programs centered on emerging work in the areas of gender studies, critical sexuality studies, decolonization, transnationalism, and critical race theory, unquote. And, you know, as important and urgent as this statement was several years ago when they wrote the grant, you know, it's sad for me to note that it's even more the case now. But the Mellon Grant has been supporting this important work for 2 years, and now this is year 3. So let me now move on to our speaker for today, Dr. Banu Subramaniam. To introduce our speaker, I want to invite up Dr. Carol McCann, who is the PI on this grant. Dr. McCann is Professor of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies. Her own work focuses on transnational feminist theory, transnational feminist science studies, and population and reproductive politics. She teaches courses on reproductive justice and also the Senior Research Capstone. And she also currently co-directs the UMBC Interdisciplinary CoLab. Please welcome Dr. Carol McCann.
Thank you very much. No, a little taller again. Okay. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who is someone I count as a colleague and a friend. We met through our participation in a feminist science studies group that migrates between science studies and gender and women's studies conferences. Through that organization, I have gotten to know Dr. Banu Subramaniam as a prolific, field-defining scholar and a generous mentor who is deeply committed to the task of imagining and creating more just futures. An interdisciplinary thinker, she works across the fields of philosophy, environmental biology, and evolutionary biology, plant science, science and technology studies, STS as I'll call it, and transnational feminisms, to grapple with questions of the entanglements and reverberations of race, gender, sexuality, colonialism, and caste in the history and culture of natural sciences that continue to impact us today. Her publications break significant new ground, open new lines of inquiry, and welcome us all, scientists and humanists alike, to rethink our knowledge-building practices. As co-editor of the Feminist Science Studies, A New Generation, she put feminist science studies on the map, introducing the STS community to a new generation of research that applies the tools of feminist scholarship to the task of understanding science as a social practice, and introducing feminist scholars to new ways of engaging with science. Her first single-authored book, Ghost Stories for Darwin, The Science of Variation and the Politics of Diversity, uses her study of color variation in morning glories to explore the racial and gendered logics that haunt contemporary debates on inclusion and exclusion in biological sciences and in society. The book was awarded the 2016 Ludwig Fleck Prize for an outstanding book across the breadth of science and technology studies by the Society for the Social Studies of Science. The award committee noted, quote, said quote too soon. The award committee noted the inventiveness with which she, quote, uses speculative fiction, autobiography, and critical analysis to show how humans, plants, animals, the living, have been divided into categories of desired and undesirable. The book does not, however, stop at critique. As the committee noted, quote, she has written a brilliant book with an optimistic and that is optimistic and hopeful, that places imagination at the center of knowing and brilliantly illuminates the spectacularly interesting and exciting relationships and knowledges that are possible if we embrace variation. Her second book, Holy Science, The Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, explores the interweaving of science and religion in the emergent nationalisms and conceptions of modernity in India in recent decades. That book was awarded the 2020 Michelle Kendrick Memorial Book Prize from the Society for Literature, Science, and the Arts. Again, the committee noted the distinctiveness of her work, saying that the book is, quote, imaginative in conception and remarkably nuanced and precise in its articulations, and that, quote, it offers both bold claims and a responsible basis for hope as we challenge ourselves to create a more just future. Her talk today is drawn from the research of her third book, Botany of Empire, Plant Worlds and the Scientific Legacies of Colonialism. The book builds on her earlier work to examine the coloniality of racial and gender configurations in the science of botany, looking specifically at three subfields: plant reproductive biology, plant biogeography and taxonomy, because it always comes back to Linnaeus, you know. Her analysis breaks open our plant naming practices, queers our views of plant and human sexuality, and reframes our notions of plant movements in ways that decolonize our knowledge and imagination of plant, human, and more than human worlds. Throughout all her writings, Dr. Subramaniam exemplifies the feminist methodological commitment to put oneself in the story through structured reflections on her own experiences in education and life. Her work demonstrates the STS commitment to take science seriously through its exploration of the circulation of ideas and materials in biological sciences in and through culturally situated knowledge-building practices. And again, always moving beyond critique, her work uses literary tools, such as speculative fiction, to imagine more just futures. In addition to her books, Dr. Subramaniam has published nearly 100 journal articles, reviews, and commentaries, 5 edited volumes, and 4 special journal issues. She co-edits a book series and served as a founding editor to Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, and Technoscience, an online peer-reviewed feminist science studies journal. That journal received the 2020 STS Infrastructure Award from the Society for the Social Studies of Science. Through all this work, she has created the intellectual venues and spaces that nurture and support the next generation of interdisciplinary science studies folks as they find their way in an academy that tries endlessly to reestablish disciplinary boundaries and bracket knowledges. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Banu Subramaniam.
Wow, thank you, Carol. I feel I should shut up before I disabuse you of all that Carol's told you about me. But thank you so much, Carol, for inviting me here. Carol and I go back a very long way, and she's been a dear and beloved and important colleague to think with over the years. Thanks also to Vrishali Patel for inviting me, and Farzana Islam, who was incredible in all the organization and reminding me for the 3rd time, still doing it so generously because I hadn't sent back some forms. So I'm really delighted to be here, and thanks to you all for coming. Humans are bodies in motion. We move with our hands and legs, on prosthetics and wheelchairs, on horses, donkeys, and camels, on ships, planes, trains, and automobiles. Muscles propel motion, hearts beat, blood circulates, food digests, lungs respire. Our bodies move atop continents, always in motion. Using the power of indeterminate growth, plants also are constantly in motion, their limbs seeking sun-soaked canopies, roots moving deep and wide in search of water and minerals. Plant pollen and seeds disperse far through human, more than human, and elemental life. Fungal hyphae span the earth. Life on Darwin's majestic entangled banks, clothed with plants, singing birds, flitting insects, and crawling worms, on damp earth, continues to celebrate a vibrant, embrangled life, forever inventive, ingenious, and playful. Years ago, plants would have seemed an odd focus to me to revisit histories of colonialism, but research from my recent book astonished me. Understanding plant worlds through history reveals how central plants were to the colonial project and vice versa. Early in my biological education, I learned that plants were mobile, using their muscles and skeletons to move, while plants were stationary, rooted in place. Today, I question the work such narratives do. The history of colonial botany is a story about more than plant worlds, how plants, animals, and colonized humans were used for and by the colonial project. By centering the plant, we see how colonists remade plants in their image, for their needs, consumption, profit, and for empire. By separating the world into nature and culture, biology elides the role of the humans in the environment. We need to bring the human back into the natural, into a nature cultural world. I use the term embrangled instead of entangled or intertwined to capture that sense of being embroiled or mired in a visceral, fleshy kind of interconnection. Interdisciplinarity can help us understand the fraught history of nature cultural embranglements, and in so doing, introduce generative alternatives to the study of global flora. But first, let us ask, what did colonizers do to the land and its inhabitants? And here Leanne Simpson is very astute when she remarks and summarizes. Really, what the colonizers have always been trying to figure out is, how do you extract natural resources from the land when the peoples whose territory you're on believe that those plant and animals and minerals have both spirit and therefore agency? And she answers in three. One, you use gender violence to remove indigenous people and their descendants from their land. Two, you remove agency from plant and animal worlds, so everything becomes an it, right? And then you reposition the land as natural resources for the use and betterment of white people. Colonialism is fundamentally a story of violence, a teeming, inventive life on Earth decimated, cleaved into hierarchies of human and non-human, superior and inferior, master and slave, native and alien, a vital, vibrant planet rendered into desolate landscapes of crashed and crushed Earth, an ecological apocalypse of pillaged lands and peoples through slavery and empire. So much of history remains grounded in the internal histories of the West and the biosciences. The power and enduring legacy of colonialism is best captured by the term coloniality. As Edward Glisson argues, West is not a place, it is a project. Colonialism wasn't a historical blip or moment in history, but an enduring installation, an infrastructure of coloniality, epistemologies, methodologies, and methods. Coloniality's infrastructure, grounded on race and gender, erased and marginalized other modes of social organization and myriad local systems of knowing the world over. One of the key insights from feminist work in the sciences is that even though nature is consistently gendered female, for example, Mother Nature, biology has persistently shaped the workings of nature as masculine and patriarchal. The rise of botany transposed colonial views of binary sex and gender, compulsory heterosexuality, and Eurocentrism onto nature. No surprise then that there is more scientific work on competition than on cooperation, or more on conflict than on coexistence, more on battle between the sexes than joyful cooperative living. Science, in short, has transformed the majestic, deep history of plant time into the reductionist linear time of botany. Colonial thought has remade plant worlds in their image. How might we undo these histories to examine, critique, and reimagine? Here I do it by queering botany, challenging our normative theories of heterosexuality, reproduction, and native geographies that ground our politics of identity and place. Queer studies emphasizes the necessity of thinking about sexuality not in terms of bodies or identity, but as fields of power. To think, read, or act queerly is to think across boundaries, beyond the normal and normative, to explore the spaces deemed marginal, vulnerable, precarious, and perverse. To celebrate, in Angela Willie's words, queer feminist desires for new modes of conceptualization and new forms of being. In queering our politics of place, I aim to challenge a biology that claims to be value neutral and apolitical. In queering nature, we see how biology is rooted not in the land, but in colonial scripts. I focus on the stories we tell about place. In 3 acts, I trace the botanical history to challenge binary claims of native and foreign and male and female. I offer it as a serious reflection on the terms invasive species and plant reproduction. I conclude with developing the idea of migrant ecologies. Act 1, migrant geographies. Plants are reimagined through colonialism as botany, where the deep time of plants are compressed into regimes of human time and capital. They were reimagined as gentlemen and ladies on nuptial beds, as husbands and wives, their reproductive parts imagined as human genitalia. Inhabited land was deemed terra nullis, where colonists discovered plants long known to natives. Consider the biogeography of some invasive species. Kudzu. first exhibited as an ornamental in a World's Fair in 1872, and was then adopted by the USDA and given to willing farmers who were paid to plant kudzu on their impoverished lands to nourish soil and prevent soil erosion. When they grew luxuriously, they were deemed dangerous and invasive. So with the Amur honeysuckle, Japanese knotweed, and the Japanese barberry. Lady Hastings, the wife of the first British Governor General, introduced the water hyacinth into India for its beauty. Today, it is the invasive terror of Bengal. Purple loosestrife, introduced for its ornamental and medicinal use, is now deemed invasive. Yet others were imported for biological control and vilified when experiments failed. The list goes on: garlic mustard, Phragmites, tamarisk, Chinese privet, and the curiously named tree of heaven. A vast majority were brought here not by lay people, but trained biological scientists, plant explorers, horticulturalists, agriculturalists, plant breeders, ecologists, and forest managers. This was the hubris of science and scientists gone awry. And yet environmental management today don't blame science or scientists, but the organisms that were willingly or unwillingly, wittingly or unwittingly, through guile or persuasion, through greed and desire, invited into the borders of imagined nations. Thinking contemporary invasion biology alongside this colonial botany reveals a profound botanical amnesia. Consider migration to the US in the last 100 years. During colonial rule, there was a laissez-faire attitude and unlimited mobility across borders. As Alfred Crosby argues, the roots of European domination of Western nations lie in their creation of new Europes wherever they went. Settler colonists ravaged native populations of humans, plants, and animals. Where Europeans went, their agriculture and animals went. They thrived while indigenous systems collapsed. Capitalist logics fueled a global flora, mass export of resources out of the colonies, growing ravages of the environment through unchecked industrialization and development in newly independent post-colonies. For example, in the 19th and early 20th century, the USDA had an active program where they sent biologists as explorers across the world to find interesting, pretty, useful, tasty plants. David Fairchild, who was the head of the USDA division, one man brought over 200,000 species into the United States. Likewise, the American Acclimatization Society in the 1890s, someone suggested, why not introduce every bird named in Shakespeare's plays into US Central Park? It's like, why not? Yeah, sure they did. Such an open policy was indeed the norm until the 19th century. White settler colonists remade themselves as the natives and enacted strict racial border policies to exclude the foreign. And this includes quarantine laws for plants and animals, and of course, Human Exclusion Act to keep out new migrants. And the plant quarantine laws came 1 year before the human laws began. The Chinese Exclusion Act, and then, of course, the Immigration Act of 1924. A biological reckoning means undoing botany's theories of global flora to unravel the coloniality of biogeography, a profound recognition that frameworks of nature in place and out of place are political constructions, fossilizing particular evolutionary ecological moments as true native nature for posterity. Biological nostalgia is fundamentally an unecological project. A vast literature reminds us that invasive species are not the problem, but rather the symptom of a much larger problem. Unchecked development, exploitative environmental policy, unbridled capitalist greed, rapacious growth to feed the gods of modernity. In fact, the distribution of naturalized species across the world today are a direct product of the histories of European colonialism, a legacy that has indelibly shaped and structured all contemporary ecosystems across the globe. The continued destruction of habitats, the willful refusal to deal with the devastating impact of climate change means that we are already past the point of no return. What then does it mean to save native species and native geography when there are no longer native environments? If we think with plants, something different emerges. Study after study chronicle how natives, along with earlier new migrants, have created novel ecosystems, indeed novel natures. The complex history of motility, mobility, and migration of multi-species biologies is the story of our planet. its past, its present, and future? How can we jettison the unhelpful, unproductive language of native and foreign? How can we distance ourselves from colonial theories about plant origins? Just as humans are more than a few races, plants are more than their native and foreign selves. They have complex histories and biologies. Rather than native and invasion ecologies, I suggest we move to migrant ecologies. Act 2, migrant biographies. We talk about plants as rooted, stationary, sessile, and immobile. But that is only true if we understand mobility in human terms, namely moving limbs. But plants have evolved innumerable ways to travel. Their limbs stretch, their roots explore, their pollen and seeds disperse far and wide. They reach each other through insects, birds, bats, and mammals. They engage the elements, water, fire, earth in their travels. Their migratory paths exploded through colonial travels. As Ruth Ozeki writes, every seed has a story, encrypted in a narrative line that stretches back for thousands of years. And if you trace that story, traveling with that little seed back in time, you might find yourself tucked into an immigrant's hatband, or sewn into the hem of a young wife's dress as she smuggles you from the old country into the new world. Or you might be clinging in the belly wool of a yak as you travel across the steppes of Mongolia. Or perhaps you were eaten by an albatross and pooped out on some rocky cropping, where you and your offspring will put roots to colonize that foreign shore. Seeds tell the story of migration and drifts, and so if you learn to read them, they are very much like books. Sex, gender, race, and sexuality thus loom large in our stories of migration. Reductive logics of heteronormative reproduction grounds all stories of biological evolution, plant, animal, and human. We must recognize the limited language not only of sexuality, but also community, intimacy, and belonging. The point is not about whether plants have sex or not. The point is our obsession with sex and our inability to think and talk about biology without the language of sex. We reduce the thoroughly inventive, playful intimacies of plants into the tired old scripts of Victorian gentlemen and ladies. As Londa Schiebinger argues, these are categories Carl Linnaeus used for a scientific classification that was both abstract and universal. Linnaeus gave primacy to plant sexuality, and his scientization of botany happened at the same time as an ardent sexualization of plants, so they both come together. Schiebinger argues that the scientific revolution and the revolution of sexuality and gender came together to elevate plant sexuality as a central focus for botany. In his nomenclature, Linnaeus did not use the words stamens and pistil, but instead moved to the word andria and gynea, which are Greek for husband and wife. Linnaeus saw plants as having sex in the fullest sense of the term, she writes. He borrowed terms for romance, eroticism, and the sanctity of love, nuptials, and marriage into his repertoire of vocabulary for plants. Plant sexuality was almost exclusively within the bonds of marriage. His renowned key to the sexual system is founded on the Nuptiae Plantarum, or the marriage of plants. Eurocentric sexual mores, binary sex and sexuality, ground plant biology even today. A quick look at plant reproductive biology easily demonstrate the impoverished frameworks of the European household. So first of all, plants are categorized by the sex of the organism, a very dubious concept even in human worlds, but such that it is, if a plant is so-called male and female, they're seen as monoecious and dioecious. If they have both within a flower, they're called male and female or bisexual flowers. Over 85% of flowering plants are bisexual in that they have both within it, and yet we are obsessed with male and female. If you look at what we have named different parts of reproductive, and this is coming from before Linnaeus' time, there's an exact correspondence of a plant reproductive part to a human reproductive part. There's an exact correspondence between the two. And then, of course, plants do their own thing. And so if a plant's pollen dehisces early, it's called protandry. If the ovules are ready earlier, it's protogyny. And then plants do extraordinary things, so we need new vocabulary to be androdioecious if they only have male flowers, gynodioecious if they only have female flowers. They can be androdioecious, gynodioecious, androgynomonoecious, gynodioecious, andromonoecious, gynomonoecious, polygamodioecious, polyglamobineous, subdioecious, subgynoecious, trimonoecious, trioecious. I will stop here. But I think you get the picture. The proliferation of terms is to accommodate a world of seemingly infinite and imaginative plant variation into the limited vocabulary of European sex lives. Why look through the eyes of European puritanical sexuality? How about the reverse? How might the exuberant sexuality of plants allow us to reimagine and rewrite narratives of human sexuality? We must also ask, do plants even have sex? Males and females never meet, touch, feel, engage. If sex is about union, closeness, attraction, intimacy, contact, engagement, feeling, pleasure, who exactly is having sex here? Flowers are intimate with insects, birds, bats. Intimacy is fostered through millions of years of coevolution. They're intimate with the wind as the pollen glides in its flow, intimate with water as pollen flows in its streams. Indeed, the ovule has no contact with the flower from which the pollen originates. Always one degree of separation. Even if they self-fertilize, there is often no intimate contact. An ableist vocabulary in biology laments the sessile, grounded, immobile plant. Yet this cursory overview of plants shows a wildly agentic plant world. It is not about movement, about mobility, about ability. It is playful, affective community intimacy with the world around. As pollen and seeds travel with the flows of the winds, the waves of the water, the power of fire, the wetness of earth, the beaks of birds, the legs of bees, the fur of animals, the pull of gravity, and the products traded by globalized humans. Pollen and seeds of plants travel far and wide, not like humans surely, but as an evolutionary strategy that far exceeds and likely outlives the human. We can and must undo the colonial language of botany. Madeline Bartlett and I suggest we understand plant morphology and anatomy not through human genitalia, but plants themselves. We suggest abandoning terms male and female, either rejecting sex and gender altogether or retheorizing them as quantitative traits. Act 3, migrant ecologies. I want to propose migrant ecologies as an antidote to the binary language that pervades biology: native alien, male female, heterosexual homosexual. A counter-colonial approach, migrant ecology offers a practical and pragmatic planetary ecology for the afterlives of colonialism that we find ourselves in. Migrant ecologies do not arise from plant ecological sciences of contemporary biology, but rather from nature-cultural approaches to plant worlds and the histories of colonial extractive economies that unleashed a grand shuffling of plants, animals, and humans during colonial regimes. It arises from the ongoing neo-colonial extractive regimes of commerce and trade, unchecked development of land, and a refusal to act on urgent signs of hastening climate change. The theorizing of migrant ecologies are both useful and necessary for our moment for many reasons. Migrant ecologies offer a nature-cultural approach. It refuses to reduce a plant to its particular individual presence in a particular place, and instead urges us to narrate a nature-cultural history of the plant, an understanding of plant through histories of empire. How did it get here? What are its histories? It forces us to track the extractive ambitions of colonial botany. Plant discovery is long known to locals, but now named for empire. It forces us to recognize that the majority of foreign species are here because of their colonial histories, especially their horticultural appeal. It offers understandings of plants not as individual or independent organisms, but as embrangled in other ecologies, particularly political ecologies of colonialism, enslavement, hegemony, globalization, and land management. It allows us to tackle multiple genealogies of colonialism, to talk about post-colonialism alongside anti-colonial, decolonial, counter-colonial, and indigenous ecologies together. It allows us to narrate how plant afterlives varied depending on their colonial travels. It offers embodied affective ecologies. Terms such as global or transnational, migrant ecologies center the plant, animal, and humans as complex embodied beings, enslaved as well as exuberant. It attempts to capture multi-species and entangled life within economies and histories. It transcends ideas of species and taxa so that they are defined by migration, not by biological taxa. Migration is an act that includes various modes such as voluntary, forced, and coerced migration. It embraces a transnational view of planetary life. It forces us to track the overflows and underflows of life on Earth, track how individuals and community move as more than human worlds. It challenges any easy colonial border and legal regimes that divide family and friends through easily drawn geographic boundaries. It embraces change and fluidity as the mode of the planet, and recognizing that evolutionary history is never static. It allows us to embrace Darwin's entangled bank and its plethora of species in complex webs of relationality. Within such frameworks, invasive ecologies that valorize Edenic visions are anathema. It recognizes the interdependence of human diasporas and botanical diasporas, insisting on relationality, linking migrant communities, and forever binding them to the lands of their ancestors they left behind, yet never collapsing the two into some essentialized mythic past. And finally, it recognizes that human diaspora and the botany diaspora have the same etymology, and refusing to create these binaries of native alien, diasporas insist on relationality and allow for more imaginative sexualities, the possibility of miscegenation and cross-fertilization through a politics of assimilation, or of remaining resolutely unique and distinct through a politics of isolation and separation. Migrant ecologies offer a more capacious framework that capture the diversity of plant and human life. In short, invasive ecologies and binary reproduction are fundamentally unecological and unhistorical, while migrant ecologies, attendant to the histories of botanical colonization, recenter political ecologies of botanical commerce, market forces, horticultural innovation, technologized and reproductive labor, and industrialized agriculture. Climate change has only made the environment more volatile, increasing periods of droughts, floods, fire, which are now routine. Migrant ecologies urge us to develop a new lexicon, moving away from the colonial language of colonizer species, pioneer species, invasive species, into a language of migration, diasporas, community, survivors, migrants, refugees. As we work to reframe colonial ecologies of the human, we must extend these imaginations to plants and animals as well. A botanical history reminds us that plant biogeography is a product of colonial extractive economies, continued greed for larger houses and cheaper disposable products. Plant reproductive biology has colonized evolutionary potential into products that can be patented, bought, and sold. Short-term profits again and again have been chosen instead of long-term health of the planet. Migrant ecologies is not an embrace of anarchic development, but confronting colonial legacies with responsibility and accountability. It recognizes that common responses, such as eradicating invasive species without changing the larger context of ecological and political, is a Sisyphean task. It offers us nature-cultural modes to rethink multi-species ecologies in histories of enduring colonial political economies. The story of planet Earth is the story of Pangaea, the supercontinent that fractured into continental formations, moving species, and leading to a dizzying evolutionary adaptations. Thus, in a flash of planetary time, colonialism reknit the seams of Pangaea, Alfred Crosby writes. Biological exchanges and movement created a world-spanning economic system. In the deep history of evolution, of human evolution in particular, we are all migrants. The embrangled story of life on Earth is not singular or universal, but complex and multiple. Some live where they were born, but others, like me, are shaped by generations of migration. Escaping a famine, my maternal grandparents migrated to the town of Nagarkoil. As is customary, my mother returned to her home in the southernmost tip of India for my birth. My paternal grandfather moved to the city for work. My father, a government employee, moved every 2 years as he was posted and transferred. Both my sister and I moved with them and finally crossed the oceans to make life in the United States. I am a migrant through and through. There is nothing innocent about this. Complex histories shape these migrations. As the quip go, we are here because you were there. Migrations have been forced, coerced, and voluntary. There are tales of abjection, enslavement, victimization, but also ones of opportunity, adventure, celebration, and joy. Primarily trained as an evolutionary biologist, life on Earth for me is never about stasis or about being rooted in one place. As Lewis Carroll's Red Queen famously quipped, it takes all the running you can do to keep it the same place. Inspired by Charles Darwin, I dreamt of a polyphonic, polymorphic biological imagination. Growing up in post-independent, multi-religious India, life was about plurality. In my lifetime, I have been stunned by the rise of an insular nativism and nationalism in both the country of my birth and now citizenship, the United States. A violent, virulent xenophobia across species. Even more remarkable is that in both nations, the majority claim victimhood from the minority. While the biota of the world has been profoundly shaped by colonialism, migrant life did not begin with European colonialism. Humans, animals, and plants have always moved. After all, in the deep history of life on Earth, who belongs where? With the continents constantly in motion, we are never still. Life evolves through the everyday, through peace and tumult, from greed and grace. That is what the planet is, a dynamic ball of mutating, migrating, and mobilizing more than human worlds. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so inspiring. Just listening to your talk, I keep on sort of thinking about animal species and plant species. And it seems like, as humans, we have all these campaigns, right, to sort of save animal species because they've gone extinct, but you don't see these sort of popular campaigns or foundations trying to preserve, plant species. And the way you present it as, the way sort of we understand them as invasive, they have this resilience, right, that sort of animal species, other animal species that are vulnerable don't have. And so there's this threat and fear that is sort of the human relationships with plant species, that they'll just take over. I guess, so my question is, how do we think about extinction and resilience when we think about migrant ecologies? Because it seems like plants have a resilience and a resistance against extinction in a way that's very different than how we think of vulnerable animal species. So thank you so much.
That's a really interesting question, and there's a word that I've heard often used in the literature, charismatic. So it's the charismatic animal and plant species that get all the attention, and that they are the poster child of in my experience, I see what you mean, but I'm also thinking about, what was that, spotted lanternfly. And I don't know if you were following TikTok videos last summer when they emerged on the East Coast. And the level of pleasure and violence and sound, because they're not particularly small, they're big. And so I think there's and similarly, if you think of of restoration ecology, a friend of mine who went to one of those conferences said, I've never seen a place with so many chemicals and herbicides, and it's all about destruction because you want to take away the invasive species and plant natives. And so in my view, I find, that happening in both plant and animal worlds. If you think of native garden clubs, if you think of native plant societies, they're all over the country, and it's all about planting native species in the garden. There are a lot of extermination campaigns, so you can go spend your weekend to the Charles River in Boston to go pull up invasive species. And I think that some people would argue there are some insects and animals that are resilient, some plant species that are not. So I think it's a vocabulary, and there's a tension between that. You're right about extinction. So there's a way for me, it's not as though, it is true, things have gotten extinct over history, but there is something about the pace of extinctions that we are facing now that is unprecedented. And so to me, the question is, what do we do about it? And to me, this solution of just saying the problem is this bad species and this bad species and this bad species, and then we educate everyone when you go to a Native Plant Society meeting is, this is a good species, plant it in your garden. This is a bad species, take it out, seems really insufficient to the task, because we are not taught about how these species came here. We are not taught about, and we still, you will see, I was just reading an article about lionfish in Florida and the problem they are, and they said, oh, we should get groupers or get some other species that will eat the lionfish. we have done this again and again and again, right? Where we bring a species for biological control, and then it does something different, and then it takes off, and then it becomes the problem. Right now with climate change, it's like, let us geoengineer, the environment. But what we don't take on are these hard questions. How are we managing land? Who is polluting the planet? How are people living? How are we growing plants and animals? Why do we waste over 40% of the food that we produce? Right, so there is a disconnect between, I would argue, the problems of the planet and then the presumed problems to which we act, right? Which is about, yes, let's go spend invasive species, or let's go recycle, where increasingly we hear a large part of what we recycle never gets recycled. So it's a kind of theater that makes us feel good, that we are good citizens, but are not really doing much about it, where the difficult questions are really about political mobilization at that larger scale than at the individual.
Thank you for your talk. It was very thought-provoking. But going back to this idea of invasive species versus what caused the species to get here, I think those are problems that can be acted on in different time frames. So there's a plant in Maryland called lesser celandine that forms mats, completely thick mats, in all of the parks in Maryland. And it has I'll say beautiful, yellow flower. And so people look at it and they go, oh, isn't that pretty? I'll plant it in my garden. But what happens is that it then prevents other plants from growing. So that removal, or the attempt not to move that species at least, I think has some value. And I think that's true with quite a few of the species that we call invasive, that we don't necessarily want them to outcompete the species that are acting as pollinators and things like that. And I think that acts at a different level than the big questions that you're asking, and that we can address those at the same time, but differently.
Okay. So I agree with the phenomenon you're describing. I am not in agreement with how you name the problem. And so, for example, I'm working on a project with Christina Jones, who's director of the Botanical Gardens at Wellesley, and Nick Anderson, who is landscape manager, and who has this idea of ecological maximalism. And the idea being that in horticulture, so if I want to redo my garden, the first thing I'm told is take away things that are undesirable. So the first thing you do is you damage and open up the land. Then I go to the garden store and look for what to plant, and they give me native species, and they'll say, this is 6 inches apart, this is 8 inches apart, mix the different colors, the tall things go in the back, right? So there are all these rules to gardens. And then I come and plant them, and then I take mulch and I put it in between it. Now, what I have created is prime way in which invasive species will come, because I've damaged the ground, and then I've created all these open spaces for weeds and other species I didn't plant to come in. And so we're doing a series of experiments to test these theories. So Nick's argument is invasive species become invasive because we create the conditions for them to become invasive, which is we clear land, we create these openings for them. And so the solution is, just pulling them up is not enough. We need to do a next step, which we often don't. We just pull them up. And so his solution or his idea that if you plant even some invasive species in these tightly knit communities, they build communities, and they will not take off. So we're testing these theories, but he has worked in lots of different plots with very dense plantings, and he would argue a lot of these species aren't a problem. So the problem is our land management is the larger part of colonial gardens that we've all been taught, to love, and the ways in which we manage the land rather than the plant itself.
I'm going to go over here because I've spent too much time in that corner. I'll come back to you.
Okay, first of all, thank you for these thought-provoking vision that you have. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about is that, human beings, bioengineering goes back way beyond,
Absolutely.
European civilizations
Yep.
going around the world colonizing. But I know that in a lot of cases now, the folks who are working, doing some kind of conservation work, whether it's plant, animal, or just general community type of things, are now looking to see people who are indigenous to an area and see, what have you done? Because what we've tried doesn't work. So are there ways of looking at things that are less reductive? And this is the kind of thing that Robin Kimmerer talks about in braiding sweetgrass, in looking at, okay, I grew up looking at plant communities and love and joy and things that don't normally come up in botany.
Yep.
And then I learned to be a botanist. And now I'm looking at things in two different ways. So what is a better way to do this? Because, I have often talked to people about native plants as well, but I tend to do exactly what she said, is plant things very densely and then see what happens, right? And it's only if something really does start to take over that I trim it back a little bit. So I think in some sense, it's getting away from an either or.
Yeah.
And doing, okay, we can't turn the clock back, but what can we do that's really going to be healing?
Yeah, no, that's a very difficult and profound question, and I completely agree with you about bioengineering. And one of the founders of our field, I think, was Carol's advisor, Donna Haraway,
Yes.
who wrote this, cyborg manifesto, and she ends with, "I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess." And basically making the point that feminism and technology are not oppositional, and that the point is that technology can be used in a feminist way, and it's, that's not the problem itself, it's the political economy in which these things get structured. So I'm completely with you there. And if you look at a lot of indigenous ecology, there is there is burning, there is removal of plants, there's addition of plants, and at the heart of most indigenous ecologies I know, the human is in nature, right? Which means you are engaging with nature, and nature is not out there, a problem we solve, but that it's in there and that we make a world together. Now, this question of indigenous studies and indigenous ecologies is very easy. And one of my worries in this current moment where, we're in, Robin Wall Kimmerer's wonderful work and many other indigenous ecologists, that now our attention is like, yes, we have stolen your land, we've stolen everything, and now give us new ideas to appropriate and steal again, right? And I think that's a move we must not do. Right? So the question becomes, how might we give land back, or how might we share the land? How do we celebrate indigenous ecology, not by appropriating it and bringing it into Western science as something new, but acknowledging the rich heritage from which it comes, acknowledging the different epistemologies that ground indigenous ecologies. And so I'm sort of watching where there's a lot of interest in it, but I'm just worrying about the ways in which it's getting reappropriated yet again as something new. And as you probably well know, there are all these terms of greenwashing, green capitalism, that a dying planet is proving fertile ground for renewed exploitation, renewed extraction. And so I think we all have to be wary about conservation efforts or efforts to green things by looking carefully at what these ideas are, what the histories of these ideas are, who is proposing them, who is making the profits out of them. And this is my, profound sorrow so I grew up in a British post-colonial education, which means after 10th grade, I did no humanities or social sciences, right? And so it's only postgraduate school that I'm learning all of this. And I'd learned none of this in my botany classes, but I think my American counterparts say the same of them. And we need to, right? We know that all we teach people is this, this is how you classify a thing, this is how things are named, without asking, where do these words come from? Where do these histories come from? Who are these people who named these plants, and why did they name them the way they did? So I think there is so much need for interdisciplinary education, which allows students to connect plants with plant histories, because they have everything to do with each other. And if we are, I think, going to move forward, it has to be moved forward with that interdisciplinary vision, which is being decimated as we speak. But, yeah. And maybe that's the reason. Hi.
Hi. I really liked what you had to say about queering botany, mainly because I also don't really have much formal education in botany, but I do have an interest in sexual health, and what you were talking about how we label parts and how it is also still in a binary, and how plants are really, it is really, I don't know how to phrase this. It's kind of minimizing to describe plants in terms of male and female, and all those terms that you showed about how some plants are bisexual and also produce only male flowers, and then some. Like, that was really enlightening, and also really cool to see that even plants are kind of victim to homophobia in a way that was brought on by colonialism. I wanted to ask, is there anything in your family life or in your upbringing or personal experience that kind of you call back to when you think of this subject? Not like when you had said not reappropriating indigenous knowledge.
Yes, my mother wanted a very clean house. We did not even have plants, forget pets. No, so to me, really, I owe it to women's and gender studies and women gender sexuality studies as a field. And when I entered graduate school, most of the people, I did graduate school here, had gone hiking. They had, trails behind their gardens. Every summer they went camping. And so they had a familiarity with forests, and of course they knew the species better than I did. And I felt like such a bad biologist. Because one, I couldn't name things, but then it's like forests scared me, honestly, because I've never been in a forest before. I grew up in urban India, and I knew the cockroaches and the lizards and all the plants that grew in crevices. And it's only through working in this project I came to recognize how botany also names who a good botanist is, who a good ecologist is one who's had that kind of upbringing, right? And then when I talked to friends who grew up in New York City or other parts, they had the same experience I did, that they did not know this so-called natural world in the way it is. And so this project has not only, and then it has allowed me to say, yes, plants grew in crevices, but I knew a lot about those plants, right? Even urban ecology is endlessly fascinating if you look at the kind of evolution that insects and plants have done in order to grow in those. You would think there's nothing there, and it starts, and then it becomes bigger and bigger, and then finally it will demolish the building, right? If you let it grow with its roots. And so it's gotten me also to recognize I did have knowledge, and I think you do have knowledge about plants. I mean, you eat plants, I suspect. Right, and there are plants that grow around us. But I think there is something about education that devalues what we know about them. And some of it for me is about, because you go there and everything is in Latin, literally, right? Even if it's common name, it's Latinized. And I don't see why. I don't see why we can't keep the names we learned about plants in our classroom. So there's a connection with the world around rather than this archaic Latinized vocabulary. And so I think, all these fields that are beginning to question the past, question how we are educating and why we are so alienated from the world around is really, really important. And I think we all need to acknowledge and get to know plants. You don't need to be a botanist to get to know plants. They're all around us in beautiful and wonderful ways. And that's the other point I think you were saying, is that I know so many gardeners will say, they told me, plant this in a, it's like medium, clay soil under this light and these zones. And there are many people who work with plants who will say, plants are far more plastic than that. And sometimes you plant them, sometimes they'll die, but if they're not doing well, if you learn to move them around, each plant is different. But we act like every individual of the species will act the same. And so the point is really, to me, it's that we need to bring playfulness back. We need to bring engagement back, and to take away these rules by which we are taught to deal with plants and actually build relations with them in our yards and what we grow.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the popularity of foraging in this moment, because I honestly have a discomfort towards people that forage but don't engage in the radical politics that foraging might ask, and seeing almost like there seems to be a separation between like foraging and free Palestine, or like foraging and land backs, and that it feels like there is a disconnection that feels very dissatisfying to me, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts
I
on
would
that.
be completely with you, but I think foraging is good. Doing foraging with politics is better. Was that fair? Because I think there are so many people, you go out there, you're not quite sure. It's like, is that the poisonous kind, or is that something I can eat? That, most of us don't know that, especially with mushrooms. It's like, as you've heard, there are some dangerous mushrooms. But that if we learned to be able to tell apart, that's a good thing. I don't know why front yards only have to have pretty charismatic flowers. It's like, maybe we can put a tomato in or a peach in, right? It's like, why not? So I think as a practice, thinking about eating from one's garden or eating from the neighborhood, I like that idea. And it seems like an important one for the planet, for our food systems. But I agree that a deeper politics would be even better.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So I really like how the examples that you gave really had me imagine our relationship in regards to sometimes we are the means in which plants sort of like express their agency. But I was wondering how you felt about, ideas of preservation that sort of idealize untouched nature, or like that extreme. Seeing as that sometimes, when we're given access to places, it just so happens that as humans, kind of ruin things that we touch, but just how you conceptualize idealizing untouched nature.
Yeah. I do not idealize untouched nature. But on the other hand, I don't think we should, start extracting gas and things from everywhere, right? So there is untouched nature, and there are extractive regimes of what one does to the land. So if we think of a lot of indigenous ecologies, it is not untouched nature, but it is nature that is allowed to thrive, and nature that is not there for us. It is nature that's there with us. And so I think that relationship to me is really, really important. And if you read a little about the history of the environment, this idea of untouched nature is, for the most part, fiction. And so even if you think of, I loved the photography of Ansel Adams growing up. And it's only after coming to this country that I was told that, yes, this is beautiful, but just here is a Native American population, and he's just cropped it. So we just see nature without humans. So much of that is manufactured. And if you look at the history of the environment, this idea of the sublime, that nature is, you go to the top of the mountain and you find God, right? That idea of nature without humans is very central to Eurocentric imaginations of the environment. These places are also at the heart of a lot of population, of eugenics, that, if you talk to Carol, will tell you about. These are connected, about that people are bad, environment is good, is connected to other kinds of politics. And this is why everyone should take a, what is it? GWIS class, because you will, it's just amazing. And I feel like a proselytizer, but when people come to knowledge late in life, it's like the connections between environment, the idea of untouched environment and preservation, and the people who promoted those ideas, the connection to John Muir, to Sierra Club, to all these environmental societies we talk about today, to population control in different parts of the world, to ideas of eugenics, all have very, very deep link. And the environment and questions of population, reproductive justice, of women's reproduction, are very intimately connected. It's only that you studied this and this. So in my women's studies classes, I studied eugenics. In my biology classes, I studied about plant variation. And then I realized all the people who I was studied in my biology classes were eugenicists. But these people, the women's studies didn't mention their names, and they didn't mention the social program. So part of my work, as I'm seeing these connections, you see that these two worlds are not separate at all. But part of that interconnection is what interdisciplinary work helps us do.
I work with children down at the nearby state park, and
when you say you work with children, meaning tours?
We run like a nature camp on like the weekends and during the summer.
Yeah.
And I think kind of ever since the spotted lanternflies have become very like demonized, the kids have become very like kind of aggressive towards the lanternflies and the like even like invasive plant species. And we tell them like, well, you still have to think about these things as living before you decide to go and kill something without thinking about it. But then they just go and kill it anyways after we tell them not to. And your presentation really helped me recontextualize like invasive species. And I was wondering if you had any advice for how to approach a subject with like children.
Yeah, but children are getting messages from so many places, right? Not just you. They're getting messages in their home, in their schools, signs or signposts around. I think all you can do is, especially with children, introduce ideas, but ultimately I think they have to make sense in their worlds, and maybe some of this is about bringing parents in and talking to parents about this as well. I don't think there's an easy solution just because it's everywhere. And part of what we do to spotted lanternflies is what we are doing with migrants as well, and getting people to see that connection. The hatred of one is related to the hatred of the other.
I'm teaching a class on arthropod biodiversity.
Arthropod?
Arthropod,
Yep,
yes.
yep, yep.
So,
All right.
So students are creating collections, and of course, spotted lanternfly is really common on campus.
They are beautiful.
Yeah, one of its host plants is tree of heaven, actually. So, and jar spiders are starting to move into this area as well, and they at large enough size can eat lanternfly. But in response to the question about how do you talk to children about treating some species like garbage, and some species like it's precious and rare. I have had in this class students that have, religious objections to killing of any animal, and the way I've approached the class with them is to focus their collections on things that they find dead, or organisms
They find what?
that they find dead.
Dead.
That they find dead. But when the question of lanternflies and should we kill them came up, a lot of folks mentioned that they'd seen articles or media reports instructing them to kill lanternflies because of the economic concerns associated with them. And I would just say, like, in my class, I'm always telling students, like, even the smallest of these organisms is worthy of respect and some understanding of, like, how it got here and what its function or how it interacts with the environment that it's in. So I would just say, like, if you can consider, that you would choose to respect somebody until sort of proven otherwise, like, do the same for the organisms, because they didn't choose to be transferred here. And I think that helps a lot of students understand, and also the understanding that time is short for these organisms, but our study is, and our preservation is long. So, I'm working with, 20-somethings and not little kids, but I think the idea is still the same, that, I would ask for respectful treatment, even when that treatment is going to involve collecting and preserving an organism. I believe that can be done, respectfully and consciously. So that's
See, you have an
my
expert
comment.
you can bring to your camp. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for your talk. You talk a lot about the dangers of maybe a biological nostalgia, I think, as you put it. And I think that's really clear here in how it's driving and is so easily able to quickly drive these kinds of, like, native ecological movements. Biological nostalgia also seems to drive a lot of other powerful things, at least in the US. I think maybe things like the Endangered Species Act or different nonprofit movements. Is there any room for a biological nostalgia of a different kind in the vision you have?
It's a really, really interesting question. I think my understanding of the root of nostalgia is really about home. That it is longing for that kind of a home, and it's not, as a migrant, it's not something I've ever had, and also because we moved around so much. And for the most part, none of these nostalgias, I think at the heart of nostalgia is you are remembering something in excess of what it was, right? And so just the other day in class where someone said, they were talking about nostalgia, and I said, okay, so which period in US history would you like to go back to? And they start, and then every time, it's like, it depends on who you are in that history, right? Depending on who you are, there's no part of US history was great for everybody. And it's so it's just bringing that out. And it's just that and I think this country and other countries have gone through this many times, the kind of simplicity of that nostalgia. Everything was great. Everyone was happy. There was no crime. Everyone had food. It's that vision that seems so dangerous and so important for us to unsettle historically. But I would say no. And I don't fully understand that impulse for, what was the question they said? Oh, do you regret anything in your life, that you would redo? That these are not things that are possible. And similarly with nostalgia, I think we can think back in more complex ways, and then I would be up, but I think that would be more history than nostalgia, and acknowledging that some people in that time were enslaved, or that our families enslaved other people, whatever those are, that if we remember it with that, but that I think it stops being nostalgia. But it's a great question. I will ponder it more.
Thank you. We have time maybe for one last question. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. This has been great. I'm an art historian and curator, and so I can't help but comment on your image program, which has been lovely. I feel like it's this dry humor that you're sort of sharing to inhabit the kind of clueless white male settler colonial outlook by sharing so many of these sort of cartoons. But I'm also curious about what are your other sort of maybe archival sources. What other types of imagery do you look at in your research? I've done work looking at sort of pharmacopoeia, illustrated volumes, from various empires, not just our sort of general Euro coloniality, photography, film, all of these things are just so rich. And so I'm just curious to hear more about what you've been looking at and thinking with.
You art historians have written too much. Seriously, I feel I'm just wading my way through. All the work on landscapes and showing how landscapes shift with politics. All the work on the imagery of all these pharmacopoeia, and then the hortus of different kinds, the ways in which things were illustrated, showing shifts and just looking at plants and how plants were drawn, shifts over time and why, the gender dynamics of that. So I feel I am just wading through that visual literature, and it's incredible. I'm learning a lot, but it's a different register. But thank you for all you do, is all I can say.
All right, so thank you for your talk. Please join us. There's food for reception. If you have to leave, take something to go. Also, we have Charm City Books is over here with Dr. Subramaniam's books if you would like to buy, and I'm sure you could persuade her to sign it for you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.